All right, well, it's great to see everybody. If we would have thought further ahead when we planned this, we might have had some caffeine instead of just water to drink. But hopefully, the today's presentation will be stimulant enough to keep us awake as we enjoy our lunch and remember last evening. But really excited about our speaker today, Drew Finn. He got his bachelor's from us and an alumnus of UNC. Uh, I'm really looking forward to his presentation. I had a chance to look through his slides. I think there's going to be some tremendous content here for those of you who are desiring careers in pharmaceutical industry and the opportunities that one, if you have a pharmacy degree, what you can do with it. So I'm not going to share any more about his background because I know he's going to talk about it in the slides. So Drew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me? Is this on? Right place, or I think it's fine. Pull this out. Oh, you up? You. I see. Well, thank you for coming this afternoon. I hope something I have to say is helpful to you in your career choices, either to decide that it's worth considering a career in the pharmaceutical industry, or pharmaceutical industry is definitely not for you. I'm going to do something else. You've got lots of opportunities with the PharmD, and I think that the world is your oyster, but the pharmaceutical industry needs people with a doctorate in pharmacy, and there's lots of positions there that I'll describe as I go through here and come around to at the very end, opportunities for you to consider. So a little bit about me. As Dr. Eccles said, I graduated from UNC in '72, and one of my classmates, Dr. Fred Eshelman, was a good friend of mine. He and I lived in the same apartment complex and enjoyed spending time together in school and out of school. And honestly, you'll learn that in the pharmaceutical industry, everything's a team effort, and you always need people to help you get to certain things accomplished. No one person accomplishes anything. And that was evident just by my entry into the pharmaceutical industry. I was working at Duke at the time, and I heard that Glaxo was going to move to the Research Triangle Park, and I decided that it was time for me to make a career change. And I knew very little about the pharmaceutical industry other than my conversations with Fred. He was kind enough to facilitate a interview for me, and so I went to Fort Lauderdale, where Glaxo was at that time, and took an interview. And the next thing I knew, I was a employee at Glaxo when they moved to Research Triangle Park. We were in a little small uh, office building out here across from where the Governor's Inn used to be. But that was the beginning of my career, and I spent 10 years there, and then moved on to a company, Belgian pharmaceutical company called Solvay. I'll talk a little bit about that as I move through it. And my role kept expanding until I reached Posen, and Posen was back here in Chapel Hill, and you'll see that as I go through and the different changes in my role. So hopefully you'll understand as you progress through the industry, there are different responsibilities that you take on, and things that you need to consider. So before I get too far into this, let me ask a few questions of you, and please feel free to answer or ask any questions of me anytime here. I'm happy to stop and chat about whatever's on your mind. But has anyone in here ever been and worked in the pharmaceutical industry? Yes. What did you do? Sorry, I didn't mean to get you with your mouth full. Very good. Yeah, I know that. Very good. Anyone else? Yes. Great. You want to come up here and teach this class? Very good. Well, I'm glad to have you here, and hope that something I say expands your understanding of the pharmaceutical industry, and you find it to be beneficial. So let me ask you one thing. what is the one FDA approved document that pharmaceutical people, doctors, everyone looks at that you should know about? Anybody have a clue? What's a package insert? Okay, sorry. Well, yes, it's the package insert that comes with the medication that you receive or that's in the box with the tablets, and that is the fundamental document that the FDA publishes that includes all the information really that's relevant to use the product. All the pharmacokinetic data, something about the toxicology of the product, what the dosage form is like. It even describes to some degree the clinical trials that have been performed on the product, and in not great detail, but some detail to let you know just what it works for and how well it works relative to placebo or whatever else it was compared to. So that's the one document that everyone should know about, and it's the one thing that FDA approves in all the marketing efforts that you see on TV these days. Everything that is in the airways really spins off of that one document. There's everything in that document can be used in some commercial capacity, or the marketing people use that. So it's important that they adhere to that document. They can't stray away from that. They can't go in and say, well, our drug works for back pain when really it's approved for headaches. You can't go there. That's just not acceptable. And the pharmaceutical, the FDA is not happy about that. And so pharmaceutical companies toe the line. Anybody know what's in an IND? What an IND is? You ever heard of an IND? An IND is the document that a pharmaceutical industry submits to the FDA to allow them to do clinical trials. So it contains toxicology. First of all, starts with the chemistry, talks and describes the molecule, how it's synthesized, what degradants occur when you're synthesizing that molecule, how stable it is, and then it also describes the toxicology of using that molecule in animals, usually rats and dogs, but depending on the specific situation, there may be some other things. There's probably a mouse study in there, maybe some rabbits that need to be evaluated before you can advance that to the clinic. There's also formulation data on the product and how it's formulated, and that is included in the IND. Along with the clinical part of that is a protocol for the first study that's intended to do, along with a plan for development up through phase 2. And FDA looks at that, and then if they find some problems with the dosing you're selecting, the population that you're choosing for your first study, then you're going to stop. They're going to stop you. They have to stop you within 30 days of the time you file an IND, or you can move into the clinic. If you move past 30 days without hearing from the FDA, then you're pretty much good to go. And so they've bought into your program there. But that usually comes from a pre-IND meeting, which we have before we actually file the IND. We talk to the FDA. We say, this is what we intend to do. This is the product we're going to work on. This is the first study we're going to do. And if FDA has any objections, wise people will take those objections into consideration, design their trial accordingly, and set their development plan up so that they don't get any problems with the agency. The last thing you want to have happen to you from the pharmaceutical industry is to be put on clinical hold. Put on clinical hold, it can take you months to get off of clinical hold. So it's better to take some time up front, talk to the FDA, make sure you understand what their position is on things, and go from there. The first studies we do are in phase 1. Those are usually normal volunteer studies. We talk about there at the time that I started in the industry, there weren't any phase 1 units around. There were very few. Most of them were associated with the university. Now they're all over the place, and so you can quickly do feed and bleed studies, or single ascending dose studies, or multiple ascending dose studies. And now there's also even specialty units that can address whether if your product is going to be used in people with renal insufficiency, then you need to investigate how the pharmacokinetics are changed in somebody with renal insufficiency. The same for hepatic disorders. So there's lots of things to be thought through as you put your plan together and move forward, and what your toxicology supports. You can't go outside of what your toxicology coverage is. If your plasma concentrations in humans are going to be, approaching the same level that you saw in the dogs, chances are pretty good the FDA is not going to allow you to use those doses. They're going to want you to go back and test higher doses in the animals, see if it was safe, and then that'll allow you to have some margin of comfort when you go into the humans. Phase 2 is where things really get interesting. Phase 2 is where you're starting to evaluate whether a drug works for something that's useful or not, or whether it's just a molecule. And so I really am a big fan of phase 2 and think that phase 2 is part of the most fun part of drug development, because you're really trying to figure out what this drug does and what doses it works in and what patients it's good for. And that, so you can evaluate a variety of different things. Larger pharmaceutical companies will evaluate multiple indications. And one of the ones I worked on where we evaluated multiple indications. It was evaluated for depression, for anxiety, and for chemotherapy-induced emesis. And so the one that actually worked was the chemotherapy-induced emesis, which was the project portion that I was involved in. So I was fortunate to be on the group that was managing the one that was really the one that was going to move ahead. So once you find out that the product, there's two parts to phase 2. Usually it's the first portion is just an open label. You're just trying to figure out what doses are tolerated well in the patient population, and if anybody responds to symptoms. Then the second part can be a pilot or even a large scale phase 2 placebo-controlled study. And if you're fortunate but to have success in that particular study, then you really only need one other placebo-controlled study usually to get the product approved. Requirements for approval are for 2 studies in the indication you're pursuing. So you can't get a product approved for migraine unless you've done 2 studies in migraine with that product at the doses you intend to use. So that's something that you'll find in the package insert usually. So older products, there's not as much information available as there are on the newer products. Phase 3 is where you're trying to replicate that. Okay, we found this out in phase 2. We now understand, we think we understand what this drug does. We've only studied, maybe 100 or 200 total patients at this point. We want to now broadcast it and see in a larger population how many patients, what the responses are, the safety is in a larger population. So you'll typically see phase 3 being multiple hundreds of millions, hundreds of patients, and a long-term safety study. So usually phase 3 is at least one placebo-controlled study and one long-term safety study. There may be, if phase 2 was not particularly successful, then you're going to do 2 placebo-controlled studies in phase 3 and a long-term safety study if the drug is intended for chronic administration. FDA sets, you can propose to FDA what sort of number of patients that you intend to include in your safety database. And usually they don't like anything, unless you're working in the area of a rare disease, they're not very keen on something that's less than 100 patients. You're going to need to include a lot of patients, usually on the order of hundreds, maybe sometimes thousands, depending on the indication that you're pursuing. So this is the organization of a typical pharmaceutical company, and this is part of it, the non-clinical side of the pharmaceutical company, and that starts, as I indicated, with the chemistry area, and the molecules then move to pharmacology to find out if they do anything that's useful in some animal model, and I can speak specifically to chemotherapy-induced emesis, and that one that we used, ferrets, for chemotherapy-induced emesis. You give a ferret high-dose platinum, they're going to vomit, and so it was proven to be a good model to test out a drug that works for prevention of chemotherapy-induced emesis. So that was the model we used at that point in time. So the pharmacologist will tell the scientist that designed the molecule whether it works or not. They need to run a series of molecules to try and find out if they get a better profile or not. If it does work, it moves on into pharmaceutical development, as I said earlier, and they'll try to formulate it. And I'll tell you a story about one product that was not so good in terms of the formulation. And if all that comes together, you got toxicology work that goes on with it, and we ultimately file an IND. When the product is IND is filed, then the product development group pretty much picks up the cause. And now we're working through the phases that I described in clinical research. You got data management statistics that are going on as a support group there to make sure that you've designed the trial right with the statisticians, you've got the right power, all the things are taken into consideration that you can reasonably take into consideration, and you've got an ample sample size. And then our regulatory colleagues. And these are all, each one of these areas is someplace that PharmDs fit. They all fit in regulatory, and they fit in clinical research, and you can even be involved in data management statistics if you really like that particular area. So it's an opportunity for you to consider depending on your own interests. And specifically in clinical research, what does clinical research make up? Well, there's scientists, which is where I started on the science side as an assistant director. And your role is really to design the studies and analyze the results. And in my case, there was also a glorified site monitor responsibility in there because we were a small company. Glaxo moved here, and there was 23 of us out there in the Research Triangle Park. And so we were trying to accomplish a lot with a fairly small number of people. I personally visited all the sites that we were going to be doing research at. So it wasn't like I just asked somebody else to go find sites. I found the sites myself, and we looked for those sites through the medical literature, who's done work in this area, what institutions may be involved in that area, talk to different people, find out what their recommendations might be for someone that could do an investigation for participate in our trial. Project management. A number of PharmDs end up in project management because you have to understand the overall scope of what's going on in clinical research and how things are moving from the product development group. Are there stability studies online? Do they have product available for you, the clinical research people to do their work? Do the statistics people have the right data management capability running? And there's all the data being entered and cleaned at the right time so that you can actually complete things on a schedule that's been forecast to management. And then I mentioned the site monitoring. We usually have a group of monitors. Now a lot of that is handled by contract research organizations. You'll find out that virtually everything that I'm describing here goes on in the contract research organizations as well, including the manufacturing. So there's a parallel industry here that supports the drivers of the pharmaceutical industry itself. And that industry also uses a lot of PharmD. So something to consider there, this wide range of opportunities in contract research organizations. So as I said, I joined Glaxo in 81 as an assistant director of clinical research. I happened to work on anti-infectives. The anti-infectives group, Dr. Eshelman was responsible for the GI group. I was in the anti-infectives. There were two other groups there. One was pulmonary and one was dermatology. And here's the responsibilities that I had: to identify investigators for clinical trials, work on the budgets with those sites, make sure they had all their institutional documents in place. That means that they had to have an ethics committee approval with the institution that they're working at. We have to have that in hand. We have to have their assigned federal form that they have to sign. Now they have to give all kinds of other information about conflicts of interest and other ways that they're being paid. So it's quite complicated just getting the institutional documents at these days for what you need to have for an FDA filing. We file every new protocol gets filed with the FDA. So we have to file that with one investigator, and then we bring the other investigators together and file those periodically. Let's say we're doing a study that's going to have 15 sites involved. The first site will be the one that will file with the FDA, and then the other 14 will file at some quarterly point with the to keep them informed of who's participating in the study. There's a lot of patient selection issues that arise in clinical trials. Is this patient the right one for the study? There's something peculiar about this particular patient that's different than what you anticipated in the protocol. Your protocol lists out the entry criteria that you want to use and the exclusion criteria, including the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. There's always some question marks. Excuse me. Momentary water break. There's always there's frequently questions about whether a certain patient comes into a particular investigator, whether that patient will qualify for the study. And you go back and forth and you have to make a call. And if you have to make a call and write a memo to the file that this patient was acceptable because you considered all the options here and ruled out any things that were going to complicate the study and agreed to allow this patient into the trial. Monitor the adverse events. That's one of the key goals. We have to report serious adverse events to the FDA in 48 hours. So we have to be on top of that if something comes up that's serious and something that's not expected, serious and not expected, so that if it's not listed already in your investigator's brochure, and then the investigators are watching for that. If it's something outside of that scope, or it's particularly severe, or it causes the patient has to be hospitalized, or God forbid, they die, all that has to be reported really to the FDA in 48 hours. That's the rules. And so then in antibiotics, we used to have to determine whether a patient was going to be evaluable or not. Antibiotics are different. You don't really do too much statistical analysis on those. You're looking for a certain number of patients in an indication, whether it's lower respiratory tract infection, but then you're looking at the different organisms that are being collected from those patients that are participating in the study. If a company wants to study Pseudomonas, as in the case of the one that I worked on to start with, those aren't the most common things that come through for lower respiratory tract infection. So you have to enroll a lot of patients to find 15 people that are evaluable with Pseudomonas in your study. So that's part of the driver of clinical trials. Is what are you looking for? I mean, every antibiotic practically works for E. coli, and so it's not like that's any great news for anyone. But what we had was one of the first products, first cephalosporins that worked for Pseudomonas, and we'd get calls all the time from people all over the country, particularly rainbow babies and children's in Cleveland, where they had a Pseudomonas problem in many of their patients with cystic fibrosis. And inevitably they call on a Saturday, and so I'd end up having to go into the office, get all the information, get them to agree to get a signed informed consent document. They're going to complete a case report form for me, and I would then box up the drug myself, call FedEx or deliver it to FedEx and get it shipped to Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland for them to manage this patient, because otherwise the patient was liable to have some serious outcomes, may not survive, and that's the case. So that was part of the job at Glaxo early on. You see, I've already talked about and resolving data queries, making sure that study drug is returned. That was part of my responsibilities, to see that indeed every site gets a certain amount of drug. Have they returned it all to us? So we have to make sure our monitors go out there and check to make sure that there's no drug sitting around in somebody's pharmacy in Chicago that is and the study is no longer in running. It needs to be back at the company. So that's the process. All the case report forms have to be signed. So we need to make sure that the investigator reviews each case report form and agrees with everything that's in there. And this is all done electronically these days. In the early days, it was all paper, but now you can do it pretty much electronically. You can sit at your desk and make sure that everything is being done properly. We also evaluate laboratory abnormalities. Any drug that's being developed in patients that have significant concomitant illnesses are going to have abnormalities. Now, whether they're drug related or not is another question. That's what we're supposed to evaluate. Can you rule, is there something else that's going on with this patient that could have caused this abnormality? Is there something else, that some other drug that they took where they were taking that could have caused this abnormality? So that's part of the activities that we have to do. Then we look at individual study reports. We draft those. Each study that's done has to have a study report with all the appendices, and there's like 20 different appendices that go along with each study report to make sure that everything is there for the FDA to review. All of this is done electronically. All of this is done electronically, so that when we send it to the FDA, we used to send up trucks with pallets full of paper. that was your deliver your NDA. Now it goes all electronically. It goes through the electronic gateway to the FDA. So there's a big pipe for transfer of these documents to the FDA, and it all has to be done in the right manner by the right people. Final documents that are usually prepared are summary documents for review, efficacy, safety, and pharmacokinetics. Everything has a summary document. And when the FDA finishes its review, they publish something called the summary basis of approval. And that document is available online if you want to look at it and find out what company X did, and if you're going to be developing a drug in a similar area, what the particular division was looking for, what the FDA is looking for, and how they manage that program. And that's extremely beneficial to those of us in the pharmaceutical industry that are trying to develop a drug in an area where there's something else that's been available. We may think ours is much better than, or lasts longer, or treats more patients, or treats a subset. Those are the things we need to consider. So when I spent my first 2 years working on ceftazidime, and then I moved on to another cephalosporin, and this was an oral cephalosporin, and that was Ceftin. And it was a pretty simple development program because it was routine, it was ambulatory, lower respiratory tract infections, skin soft tissue infections, urinary tract infections, nothing very sophisticated with Ceftin tablets. Let me make sure that I qualify that. Injectable cephalosporin injectable Zofran was the first thing that was probably, if I have to look back on my career, was the one product that was absolutely the best product I ever worked on. It was safe and it worked great, and it stopped chemotherapy-induced emesis in its tracks. And it was just a marvelous product to work on. I did all the US clinical trials for that product, and even did a study in Venezuela with a professor from UNC who was on sabbatical in Venezuela down there. And I got to visit him down there to see the patients being treated in Venezuela in our trial. And that trial turned out to be one of the pivotal trials for approval. We had 3 trials for approval, and that was probably the one that carried the day the best. So I was very pleased to have the opportunity to work on that product, on that particular indication at that time in my career. Zofran tablets followed. We were using Zofran tablets for a different kind of emesis. It wasn't for highly emetogenic chemotherapy. It was for less emetogenic, like Cytoxan and other things at that time, not for platinum. Platinum is really something that needs injectable Zofran for, not the oral tablets. And finally, I helped evaluate the product in prevention of postoperative nausea and vomiting. And that was a different set of investigators, a whole different exercise. It wasn't as much good data on its utility, and the models weren't as great in the animals, but we were able to get that product approved as well, that indication approved as well for injectable Zofran, sorry. The last product I worked on for Glaxo was the worst product I worked on, and Ceftin suspension. And the group that was responsible for the product before I became involved didn't have a good year in the U.S. It was a great year for people because there wasn't much flu around. It was a bad year for the pharmaceutical industry that was interested in studying people who have infections. And so when you look at the respiratory infections that year, they were very low. And so the whole program was behind schedule, and they asked me if I could come in and try and get it back on schedule. And I came to the product and I looked at it, and it's like the closest thing I can describe it in is like spackle, that you'd spackle a hole in the wall in your room on. It was that thick. It had a big mouth on it, about that big around on the bottle, and you literally had to spoon the product out, stick a spoon in there and get it out, just like you'd do for something that's certainly a lot more viscous than most normal suspensions. And it tasted foul. And I tasted this, and the taste lingered for about 5 or 6 hours after tasting it. I'm going, nobody's going to use this drug in the United States. Why would they use this drug? This is a load of rubbish. Well, the British didn't believe me, And so they said, go ahead and develop it, get it done. We went to South America, ran the studies in Venezuela and Chile and Argentina and I guess Costa Rica. We got the studies done. That was their winter. So we picked up the winter and summertime down there and were able to get all the lower respiratory tract infections done, upper respiratory tract infections, as well as the middle ear infections. And middle ear infections, you have to stick a needle through the tympanic membrane and isolate, collect material out of that pus and culture that to make sure you know what organism you're working on. Most middle ear infections are viral. So pulling out some pus that just doesn't grow any bacteria, that doesn't do your product any good. It's not going to get any approval. It's not going to help you in getting the approval. You need to make sure that you're culturing something that's of benefit, that the drug may be of benefit from. But we did the whole program, came back, had the results ready to submit to the FDA, and marketing said, we agree. This thing is foul. It's a terrible drug. We're not going to market it. We can't market it. So I wasted a year on that project right there, just trying to get this thing done. And ultimately it went nowhere. Finally, they reformulated it, which is what I had proposed them to do a year before that. And they went to a different ester. This was cefuroxime axetil. And there was another, our own pharmaceutical group here in the Research Triangle Park had reformulated it and come up with cefuroxime pivoxetil, which was just like C-chlor in terms of taste. It was wonderful. It was poured like a normal suspension. It was a delightful product. And I think that's ultimately the one they developed, but I left before that occurred. I could see that that was going to be a challenge going forward. Okay. So I'm going to skip through then pretty quickly. I was Vice President of Clinical Research and Biometrics at Solvay. That was the one notable event I will call your attention to. It's listed at the bottom of the slide. Solvay is a company that has two research branches, one in the Netherlands and one in Hanover, Germany. The Germans wanted to develop a drug that was an antiarrhythmic for angina. As you know, angina is a fairly benign condition. People aren't subject to sudden death in angina with angina, but they wanted to use this antiarrhythmic for that particular indication, which I thought was crazy. And so, but they wouldn't listen to me. So I found Dr. Lipicki, who was the head of cardiorenal, who would be the individual responsible for proving that. He was speaking at a clinical pharmacology meeting and in Bethesda, and I went to that meeting. He finished his talk. I buttonholed him by the coffee pot and asked him to sit down and have a short conversation with me. I said, Dr. Lipicki, I said, my company is asking me to develop this calcium channel blocker for angina. And I'm concerned about that and about its risk for patients and whether there's going to be a lot of sudden death associated with that. And Dr. Lipicki sat back and he leaned back in his chair, and I can see his Ted stockings right now peeking out from under his pant legs. And he said, Dr. Finn, he said, I don't believe that drug is going to be approved in your lifetime or your children's lifetime. There you go. That product, but the Germans didn't stop developing it for 10 more years. It never reached the market. But calcium channel blockers are notorious for extending the QT interval, corrected QTs, and you end up with arrhythmias on top of that, and that causes a great problem. So that was one of the things that that was the highlight, I guess, of my career at Solvay. I came to North Carolina back in 2000, did some work for a company developing migraine products, stopped a drug from being developed there, did 2 positive phase 2 studies with that, and then left and started my own company with another fellow, Dr. Mark Sergo. And we founded a company called Arius Pharmaceuticals. It was here in Chapel Hill that we started it. We were successful at licensing a buccal tablet from a company in England, and we were successful at licensing a bilayered film technology, buccal film technology, from a Colorado company. After 18 months, we merged the company with a company that was already public called BioDelivery Sciences. And our portfolio that we had at Arius became the BioDelivery Sciences portfolio because they really didn't have anything. Our funding came from a hedge fund, and we had a certain number of dollars to be able to get this thing done, get this first product through. And the product was for breakthrough cancer pain. And so we had designed the studies, we had all the right investigators working on it. And but this is our first shot at this. We really hadn't done anything prior to this, and we took our product into that patient population. And I can tell you that was one of the most nerve-wracking days. It was probably more nerve-wracking than before the game last night for everyone. But waiting for that p-value to roll up on the screen as I was sitting there in front of the computer watching the statistical data come out. And when it hit the p less than, it was 0.0005. It was so much better than placebo. We thought we were home, and we were. And that caused a little bit of a local stir. We made that, in case you don't recognize me, I'm the guy on the left there. And but the company uh, referred to the company as Two Men and a Dog, because it was basically Mark and myself and his dog Spanky, and that was the team early on. And then we had success with that, and ultimately got the product to the U.S. market along with two other drugs. The last one being buprenorphine. And buprenorphine if you don't know what buprenorphine is, it's something to think about a little bit. It's a partial mu agonist. So it's not like fentanyl or morphine or anything like that. It's a very active analgesic, but it doesn't have the respiratory depression activity that a Schedule II narcotic does. And one interesting story associated with that, it was also being used for opioid dependence. And the reason they learned that the drug worked for opioid dependence was because of English fishermen. English fishermen would be addicted to heroin, and they'd be going out to sea and have to be at sea for 30 days, and they'd inevitably go into withdrawal if they couldn't, because they couldn't get their heroin. So they would get some buprenorphine while they were out, and they would take buprenorphine, and they'd be able to function fine while they were out in the sea and do their fishing. And when they come back in, they'd go back to their heroin. But it was a replacement that allowed them to function and keep from going into withdrawal. The drug did work that, but can also displace full mu agonists like morphine. And that was one of the things we had to work around in the development program. We had to figure out how we could start somebody that was already on a significant amount of oxycodone and switch them over to buprenorphine. And that required some considerable research. And then we had to do, with Dr. Eshelman's company, we did a QTC prolongation study down in San Antonio. And that was one of the more interesting studies that I was involved in, and worked with a cardiologist, expert cardiologist from Denmark. And that was great fun. So BioDelivery Sciences, we developed 3 products, and each one of those received approval on the first review. We formulated 2 injectable products with buprenorphine, but never got those through to development because the manufacturer couldn't scale it up of sufficient degree that it could be used in the clinic or would ever be commercialized. BDSI just sold last month for more than $600 million to a company called Collegium. So, and the only products they had was the products that we developed and one more that they licensed in. So very grateful to see the success of the company since I left. I left in 2016, retired, spent 4 or 5 years traveling around with my wife. We went all over the globe, and now I'm back as the acting chief medical officer for a small company in Cary called Avior Bio, and we're working in the area of pruritus, or chronic liver disease, specifically primary biliary cholangitis. So when Dr. Eckel told me what he wanted me to do, I said, well, I'm right in the middle of all these things trying to find investigators for this trial. And the primary biliary cholangitis is a rare disease, and they're not falling out of the trees. It's not like you're looking for, urinary tract infections. This is a real difficulty. So less than 200,000 is a rare disease. So I found a fellow that's the head of the primary biliary cholangitis registry in England. They've got 9,000 patients that they can survey and see if they would be interested in participating in our study. I also located the head of the Japanese registry for primary biliary cholangitis. So I'm piecing it together slowly right now, but that's what I'm doing right now, is trying to piece this program together so we can get the study done. We are planning on working in Kazakhstan and in Poland, as well as in Australia, and India. So those are the areas that I'm working on right now. We were going to work in Russia, but then the whole thing blew up because of the war, and so that undermined my plans at the time. So that's replanning. I've completed an entire tox program that's been run in India, and we've completed one clinical trial in India, in Malaysia, and we're getting ready to do a second trial in patients with hepatic dysfunction in India. And hopefully we'll file an IND sometime mid-year. So what's available for you? PharmDs have lots of opportunities in the industry. I've talked a lot about my particular career in the pharmaceutical industry, but there's other things in the pharmaceutical medical science liaisons, medical affairs, where you're interfacing with the public on a regular basis when they're calling in with an adverse event, or a doctor's office if they're calling in about a question about using a drug in this particular population. There's a whole group that does that. There's drug safety groups that report all the safety on the products that a company would has in the marketplace. There's project management. I described that. Regulatory affairs, a very interesting area to work in if you like, studying documents and really understanding what the FDA is looking for, interfacing with the FDA. And then of course there's corporate leadership. Sales, on the commercial side, there's opportunities for PharmDs. There's PharmDs that are in sales. There's PharmDs in marketing and analysts, product managers. PharmDs become product managers in some companies, some places division managers, and then there's a licensing group. So any company that has an asset, and it's not being used in some place in the world, they're interested in out licensing so they can make more money. They want to make more money if they can get it sold in Kazakhstan as opposed to just in Belarus. I don't know. But they're looking for out licensing opportunities as well as in licensing opportunities. You've got a portfolio of products. You've got a sales force that's calling on this particular group of physicians. They've only got one product in their bag. Can you get another product in their bag, which really helps support the cost of that sales force being out in the field? So that's marketing, commercial. And then there's, as I said earlier, there's contract research organization industry. That's a big industry. It's a growing industry. It's always growing. There's huge companies out there, and they work all over the world. They don't just work in the United States. They work in Kazakhstan, and that's how I found the one place I'm looking at. And then there's the government side of it. There's a number of PharmDs that have moved into government, and they're responsible for reviewing the documents and talking to people like me who are proposing crazy things to them, and they say, no, Dr. Finn, that's not what we want you to do. You can't really do that. This is what we want you to do. And or they educate you, which is a great thing for a small company that you haven't worked in an area before, and they've got a wealth of experience on that, and you learn a lot from the FDA, and it can be a very, very good interaction. And am I running over yet? Okay, so then there's the safety analysis and the project management within FDA, and all that's what a pharmacist can do, clinical PharmDs can do. So what I would look back on my career, I said I could not have done anything else that I would have enjoyed nearly as much, that could have helped so many other people over my career. I spent 40 years doing this, and if I had another 40 years to do it, I'd do it again. And so that's what I do. I hope that some of what I've said this afternoon is helpful to you. Thank you for your attention this afternoon. Do you have any questions? Sir. The question. Well, as it turned out, my job at Solvay, people were after me. So headhunters will come and look for you if you've got a reputation of accomplishing something inside a company. They're looking for somebody in another company that doesn't have that level of expertise, and they will come looking for you. If you're interested in a company and you're looking for something outside that, and I haven't done that this way, but you can easily go to the web, and there's plenty of opportunities to look at there. When I came to Posen, they came after me. I was actually consulting for them, and they decided they wanted me to be their EVP for development. And so I knew some of the people there, and they hired me to come be the EVP. And then as after that, it was my company. So I didn't have to. It wasn't much of an interview for that. And so we just started, and we kept working forward. The interviews came along when really at Posen we were doing interviews on. Actually, we had to go. We went around Europe and around the United States as we were trying to put a public offering in place. The company went public, and so you're having to present to investors. That's one of the things I like least about this business, is having to work with investors. And so my preference is working with the science, the data, the clinicians, trying to understand what the opportunities are and what patient needs might be. But some people feel differently. They love working with the investment population. I think they're a whole bunch of idiots, honestly, and they wear me out with dumb questions. They all know how to develop a drug better than I did, and none of them have ever brought one to the marketplace. So it's very exasperating talking to them. But keep that in the room, if you will, or wherever. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your attention this afternoon. Have a good afternoon, and go Heels. Thank you very much. Hi. Yes.
My name is Jacob Robinson.
Hey, Jacob.
I
Very nice to
appreciated
meet
the
you.
talk today.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I'm a third-year pharmacy student, so just getting done with the third year. And I actually came from the Midwest, and so I did a master's degree in cancer biology before I
Oh, you
moved out
did?
here.
Really?
Yeah, and so
Oh, great.
I've been really involved in research a lot with things,
Fantastic.
things like that. And when I moved out here, I got to see the opportunity that exists with industry that I was unaware of, really.